Yes. All right. So today we are very happy that Alyssa Weiss joins us. She's associate professor at the Learning Sciences and Educational Technology at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education and Human Development. And she's also the director of LEARN, NYU's university-wide learning analytics research network. And in her research, she combines insights and theories from the learning sciences with her interest and background in educational technology. And her work emphasizes the need for learning analytics research grounded in theory and resulting in systems that are useful for students and teachers. And Alyssa has played a very large role, a prominent role in the field of learning analytics, not only with her research output, but also with her service to the community in terms of, for example, editorship of the Journal of Learning Analytics and her former role in the Solar Executive Committee. So we're very happy that she's joining us today, and she's talking about her work and her team's work concerning co-designing learning analytics. So Alyssa, thank you for being here, and yeah, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Anushka and Vita, for organizing this, and thank you everybody from all over the world, it seems, for coming to talk. It's really awesome to see everybody's faces. It makes it a little bit more personal, though I think as I put my slides on, I won't get to see your faces anymore. Let me dive into it because I think there's actually a lot of stuff that hopefully we want to share today, and then I want to make sure we have some time for questions and talking. All right, Anushka, Vita, you guys can all see the slides?
Yes, all good.
Okay, excellent. Then I'll get started. Today's talk is called Designing Learning Analytics for Humans with Humans. So I thought it was appropriate before diving in to show a picture of some of the humans who've been involved in this work. This is the NYU-LEARN team, and as Anushka mentioned, NYU-LEARN is the Learning Analytics Research Network here at NYU. It's a really exciting initiative that we're in our second full year now, and we have faculty and postdocs and PhD students and master's students, some of whom I know are on this webinar as well, who are working together to conduct work that's at the intersection of learning analytics, research, and practice. So we're trying to do work that's both informed by theory.
We can't hear you, Alyssa.
Oh, no.
Yeah, we do.
Nobody can hear?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. I think if some people can hear me, then the problem is not on my end, hopefully, yes? Okay.
Please continue.
I think I was saying that our goal at the Learning Analytics Research Network is to conduct work that's at the intersection of research and theory, where we're both drawing on theory and contributing back to it, while at the same time we're creating practical projects that are making a difference for learning here at NYU. So this is the team of researchers, but what's important to note is that we're not just a research unit, so we have a really powerful set of partners in IT, and we're really pleased and thankful to get to work with such a great staff unit that's interested in partnering with us. And I mention that because you'll see throughout the work we do that doing the kinds of work we're talking about really requires these wide-ranging partnerships. It needs people on the ground, and it needs community members across all of NYU schools. So in addition to our group and NYU IT, I also wanted to recognize just some of the many people we're working with, faculty, students, staff across NYU schools. And the list is longer than this, but these are the ones who are involved in the projects I'm going to talk about today. So let me start with a basic premise that my guess is most of the people on this call already agree with or you wouldn't be here, which is that at the end of the day, learning analytics isn't about creating new technologies, it's about creating tools that are going to allow humans to do things better. And particularly, our goal is to do teaching and learning better. In order for this to work, learning analytics become part of a socio-technical system where human decision-making and consequent actions are going to be as big, if not a bigger part of any successful analytics solution as the technical components. So while we start off thinking about analytics as this very technical endeavor, which it certainly is, it's really important that we bring in people from the very beginning and thinking about how the tools we're creating are going to be used. Despite the fact that I think most people would agree this is important, the literature is somewhat depressing in terms of how much this has actually been done. In a review of the literature from 2004 to 2016, which is both recent and a span of more than 10 years, only 6% of student-facing learning analytics systems reported a clear, explicit needs analysis, and only 11 reported any form of usability testing. If we go broader to look at all sorts of learning analytics tools, only 30% of dashboards described from 2010 to 2015 included a report of authentic user evaluation. Why is this important? Well, misalignment between what designers are trying to do and what students' perceptions of a tool are can result in distrust of a tool, which certainly won't make it be used. And going back to the seminal work of CUBE and thinking about ed tech more broadly, tools that are designed without consideration of the user's needs and the situations in which they're likely to use them are not going to impact real-world practice in any significant way. And the history of ed tech has shown this again and again as tools either get ignored or repurposed, but they don't have the impact and change on teaching and learning that we imagine. So, in summary, the first decade of learning analytics didn't focus as much on the people as probably would be ideal, but the focus on technical systems before human ones in some ways might have been appropriate and need to happen. You can think of the first 10 years maybe as figuring out what we could do, understanding how to work with data, data streams, data infrastructure, different analytical tools, the kinds of results and the information they could provide. So now that we know all the different things that could be done with learning analytics, it's time to think about what we should. So there's this gap and this gulf between how learning analytics have been designed and best practices in human-computer interaction design. So now that there's great interest in evolving the intended users of learning analytics in their design, we can draw on this large existing literature in HCI to help inform what we're going to do. And I wanted to also point out, for a little closer to home, there's been a spotlight on these issues in the recent JLA special section on human-centered learning analytics. So for those who are interested in this, you can read more about different takes on this, including one of the ones I'm presenting today. And if you go to learninganalytics.info, all of the papers are open and available. So designing learning analytics for humans with humans, hopefully at this point or even before you jumped on today, you're on board and agree with me that this is something that's important, that we need to include the people who are going to use the tools in their design if we're going to build tools that are useful and that are used. But the question is, how do we go about doing it? It's certainly a case of maybe easier said than done. And we can think of the ways users might be involved in the design of a learning analytics tool on a spectrum. So at the least involved stage, we have the notion of getting information on, either looking in the literature to learn something or talking to other people about the people you're designing for. So a classic case is talking to teachers about what students need when you're designing for students. That provides some information, but it's a lot better when we start moving towards the right side of the scale. So gathering inputs from means we're actually talking with the people we're going to design for, learning about their needs, learning about how we can design a tool that's really going to fit in to their daily practices. And then moving either farther along to the right, we have the notion of generating ideas with, which is the practice of co-design. So what I'm going to do for most of our time today is talk about two examples, one in the middle and one on the right. So one situation where we worked and gathered input from instructors to help design and redesign tools for their use. And then a second one where we generated ideas with students where they co-designed a learning analytics solution. So let me step back and give a little bit of background on learning analytics at NYU. I'm here talking on behalf of NYU-LEARN, which is the Learning Analytics Research Network. But as I mentioned at the start, learning analytics is bigger than just our research group. It involves people across the schools and central IT. So on the whole, learning analytics here is a collaborative effort focused on community change that puts people, not data, first. And what's exciting is that is actually a statement that came from our IT group. And I think that's a really important statement to the commitment to creating tools that are really meant to be used by people. So one of the things that we do is we build partnerships between researchers, information technology staff, faculty and administrators, and students to jointly advance data-informed teaching and learning. And the goal is to create and support effective tools that augment human capacity to improve educational processes. So we have a whole host of projects in development, and I'm going to focus today on 2 or 3 of them, depending on the time, to let you see how this is done. The first one I'm going to talk about is the Instructional Dashboard project. So the NYU Instructional Dashboard project, the initial design process, this is something that was actually brought about through sort of the university structures, through IT, and through our teaching and learning communities. So the initial scope and goals were actually established before NYU-LEARN existed, and they did a quite good job in sort of thinking about how do we develop a university-wide learning analytics system that's eventually going to operate at scale, but really taking the idea of data-informed decision-making at the heart of it and putting the instructor of record at the heart of the service. So one of the key principles from the start is this is for the instructors and with the instructors. So I, as an instructor, have the ability to invite or not invite someone into my physical classroom. And as a metaphor, you can think of that also in the online space. So whatever happens within the online spaces I create for my course are within my purview. And so this has been a powerful way for people to feel, I think, safe in that the analytics are being created for them and with them, but not done on them. A couple of strategies that were planned from the start that turned out to be quite important. Number one is drawing on existing knowledge and relationships. No effort starts from ground zero, and in fact, our instructional technology folks and the ed tech folks in the schools have had years of working with innovative instructors to develop different ways of teaching. There's relationships, there's ideas of what are common problems across the university. So this wasn't a new team starting from scratch, but building on prior attempts to innovate with technologies and the history that those have created. The other big strategy was to get an early version in the hands of humans. So not to iterate to a perfect version in the abstract, but to really get this out as soon as possible to see how it intersected with the daily teaching practices of our instructors. And finally, the last principle was to iterate quickly and try to go through as many versions as possible and improvements, but to scale slowly. And this is something that if you work in an institutional context, sometimes there's a desire to scale up very quickly. We've been fortunate in that there's been a lot of patience in saying, let's work with real users in the field, but make sure that we get this right before we're taking it out to many more people. So I wanted to highlight, this is not going to be the focus of this section, but I wanted to highlight what I think was a really important strategy that was engaged in for the design of the initial tools before they went out into people's hands. And that was to drive design with use cases based on instructor questions as the starting point. So one might think, well, the best way to do this is to go talk to instructors and say, what would you like to know? But if anyone has done user-centered design before, it turns out that's not a great strategy. It's way too open, it doesn't constrain the space, and people often don't necessarily know what they want or even aware of the possibilities. So here we engaged in an iterative strategy where IT would sort of think about what was possible with the data and write up a case. And then at NYU-LEARN, we would talk about what would be pedagogical questions related to that. And then it would go out to the instructors who would be able to validate and say, yes, this is, a problem. I do teach a large class and I have no idea if students are preparing and how that preparation is making them ready for class or not. Or they would say, well, you kind of got it right, but we need to tweak it. So we had an iterative cycle where we started out with artifacts that we generated, but then we brought them out to real instructors. And this actually resulted in 5 use cases that were the starting point for developing the initial dashboards. The focus today is not on dashboard design, but I feel like if I'm talking about how people use dashboards, you need to see a bit of what they looked like. So this is one of the dashboards that was developed, and the first was a resource activity view. And the purpose was to identify students who were and were not engaging with the resources and to identify resources that were frequently and infrequently accessed. So it was kind of a basic grid heat map sort of thing. You had the resources on the left, the students across the top, and you had different dots where the size of the dots would tell you how many times they'd accessed something, and the intensity of the color would tell you how long they'd accessed it for. So there's a bunch of information here, and instructors can look across the rows and see which are the readings or slides or videos that are getting accessed quite a bit, and which are the students doing that, where do these intersect, and what's going on. Now, obviously, what does one do about that is the real question, and that's what we're going to get into in a minute. A second dashboard that I developed was a quiz results view, and this one was designed to help instructors answer questions about what aspects of the materials were difficult for students. So here we have the quiz items, you have the score for each item at the class level, and then you can dig into the details and see, okay, students are getting these questions wrong, are they on a similar topic? Then I can go back and see, did they look at the resources on this topic, or are there not enough of those? So various kinds of dashboards were developed. These are all based on LMS data. There is a sense in which you can see that these are somewhat generic in nature, and that was intentional because the goal is to have something that could be used by anyone teaching any kind of class. So these are very different than some of the niche analytics that you might see that are really tailored to particular tools. But what I want to talk about for this segment of the webinar is, what did it look like to take these tools out and put them in hands of users, and make the argument for why you should always do this as soon as possible and how you can learn from it. So first forays into the field, these dashboards went out into the hands of instructors. And not at all surprisingly, the process of actually using analytics to inform your teaching decisions is quite complex. So you can take these designs into a usability lab and someone can say, yes, I can tell who's using which resource. But having to interact with that in the context of your course and figuring out how to change your teaching is a really different task. And that was what we were interested in. So there was a tension that we observed, which was that all of the instructors involved in the early pilot, and there were 5 of them, were excited. There was high value. They thought this was going to be really important. But there was a lot of struggles to connect the data with their teaching and with their daily routines. So in a sense, you can see that there was a gap between this data that was provided about the student's activity and how that information could be used to guide their sense-making and pedagogical action. So the short answer is we needed to examine the process of analytics use in situ. In other words, going out of a usability lab and trying to understand what did faculty do with these tools when they were available to them. So we conducted a study, and what I want to talk about with this study is that this is a way to get input from users that goes much beyond sort of saying, what do you want? What would you like to know? It's an engagement and a conversation that was able to dig out a lot more of the situated practices of how analytics fit into their daily teaching, which, as you're going to see, had big implications for dashboard redesign, but more importantly, it had implications for things we didn't even know were needed in terms of support for dashboard use. So the questions we wanted to investigate were, how do instructors make pedagogical decisions based on analytic data, and what implications does this have for design? And the approach was to conduct case studies with all 5 instructors who use the dashboard in their teaching. We did these as the semester was wrapping up. This was a conscious decision and a compromise to not go in and follow them throughout the process, and it turned out to be a very good one because I think our involvement during the semester would have really influenced how they used them. Because we found very quickly that what we thought might have been sort of an interview, walk us through what you thought through with the analytics, actually became a negotiated sense-making conversation. So that is why there's a picture of me there, because I think as a faculty member and someone also instruct, the interviews had this dynamic of 2 instructors thinking through data. And so by working with the instructors to understand how they'd thought about the data, where they had stumbled, we actually ended up in the sense-making conversations and got a sense of where they had hit roadblocks along the way. So the template for our inquiry, the way we set things up, we drew on the very little that was out there in the literature on how do instructors work with analytics in the first place. So there were some basic models around asking questions, interpreting data, taking action, and checking the impact. And there were some subcategories that I'll talk about in a bit. But these led us to just start at the very high level, asking, how do instructors ask questions? How do they interpret the data? How do they respond? How do they check the impact? And what else that we didn't know about going in would be important. So we went through, we conducted the interviews, we did a thematic analysis, and we came up with a whole bunch of emergent themes for the first 3 research questions. It turns out that there was very little response to the analytics. There was a lot of, this is interesting and fascinating, but that step to taking action wasn't happening. So there was not too many themes to do with checking the impact of action. But then there was a whole host of important other aspects that we had not necessarily anticipated going in. Questions of transparency, affective components became very important. Analytics were seen as useful, but not essential enough to dive in. There was a big learning curve where people needed to feel comfortable, and the potential value of collaborative interpretation really came through very clearly. So I know there's a lot on this slide, but fortunately we already have worked that together into a model of what the instructors were doing. So I'm going to walk you through some of the findings and talk about their implications for our design of the dashboard here, but I think there's also larger lessons that can be drawn. And for people who want to read more, this is the work that we wrote up and published in JLA this past summer. So the basic structure of sense-making followed by some pedagogical response held from the literature, but there was quite a bit of changes and details within the sections. So let me walk through where the model ended up. While the literature talks about people coming to data with questions, we found it was much more common for instructors to come with a general area of curiosity more than a specific exact question to be answered. This would often, in interaction with the data, help them generate questions. And that, I think, was one of the most powerful things that we found, was that through working with our tools and working with the data, instructors came up with very different questions than they had generated earlier with the use cases, because now they understood what was possible. So this really speaks to the importance of an iterative process where you get early prototypes in the hands of the users very quickly so that they can see what's possible and come up with new ideas. Because what people think they want before they touch the tool, as we've known for a long time, is quite different than what it turns out they'll actually do with it. So we have this tension between areas of curiosity and questions leading to new curiosity that all pushes us forward to the phase of interpreting data. I think the big finding to highlight here is that interpreting data wasn't really a singular process, but had two distinct components. The first component, which is quite narrow, was reading the data. And this is a very narrow view of interpretation, and it's sort of saying, what does this information on the page in front of me mean? This is the kind of stuff that usability studies can be really good at getting at, but you'll see there's another piece. So we saw quite a bit of getting oriented and then paying focused attention to a piece of the data, or in some cases, focusing on a piece of the data and then using that to make sense of the larger picture. So there was a lot of diving into very specific data points and then jumping back out and trying to figure out what the data meant. The other thing that was absolutely critical, and I think this is something that as a learning analytics community we are starting to do better with but need to do more of, is thinking not just the data that's being provided, but what it's going to get compared to. So instructors were constantly looking for absolute or relative reference points. If you know that a student accessed the readings 12 times, is 12 low? Is 12 high? Is it as many times they should? It depends on a lot of things, but without a comparison point, that number is not very meaningful. And the common thing is to look across the class and compare students to each other, but that doesn't always give you the range, because there's always going to be people who probably do less and more than is needed. And so having some other reference points, some absolute ones, can be valuable. In the absence of this, we found instructors really relied on sort of the obvious ones like 0 and 100. So if everybody scored 100, it would be great. So they would look for who didn't get 100 or who did get a 0. And that's useful, but that's really only targeting the very upper or lower end. So I think one of the big takeaways is to start thinking about how to embed reference points, or to allow instructors to embed reference points. So for example, if you've got a quiz, you might have your expectations as to how students are going to do on it, and then that can be the comparison for how they actually do. Because if we don't know what we're expecting to see in the data, it's hard to make sense of what's actually there. Assuming that we have been able to figure out what the data is saying in that narrow sense, we then find that there's a second part of interpreting data, which is really interesting. And this, again, is the reason why testing in the field is so important, because this is stuff that's not going to happen in a lab. So we found almost immediately instructors wanted to triangulate. One data point really wasn't enough to convince them. So if they see that nobody's doing things online, but it doesn't match what they're feeling in the classroom, they're unlikely to trust the data. Now, this contradicts a lot of the premise of learning analytics, which is, the data speaks in absolute form and we'll believe it. But we found that for a variety of reasons, some cognitive and some affective, that didn't happen. It's also important to think about contextualization. So if I look at a data from someone else's class, I might see a big dip. It doesn't seem like students are doing much, but the instructor for one of these said, students wouldn't be accessing the material at this point. They're kind of boring. Now, that raises potential other problems with that particular situation, but you as an instructor, you know which readings are hard, you know which readings are challenging. There's a lot of information that's not in the data that we bring to making sense of it. And finally, making attributions was a really interesting one. And this is something that doesn't come from the data, but we saw instructors doing it a lot. So if the students didn't read something, is that because the instructor assigned too much, as this instructor thought? Is it because the students were busy preparing for something else? Is it because they just need to work harder? Is it because it wasn't a good reading that wasn't helpful? So this really gets to the question of why were the patterns found, and that we found was the area that, for now at least, the tools provide the least support, but that was really what was needed in order to take action. So a lot of times instructors kind of got here and they got stuck because they said, okay, there's a pattern. I think I might know a little bit about what it means, but I'm not sure what the reason for it is, and thus I'm not sure what I want to do. The other thing to note is that I've described it so far more or less as a cognitive process, but there was all sorts of effective things going on. One instructor worked so hard to pick painstaking readings and was rather crushed that they weren't being read by the students. Another instructor saw some improvement and felt really, really excited. And so I think a lot of learning analytics has sort of imagined this process as very straightforward and cognitive, and what we found was there was all sorts of feelings, valid, important feelings coming into play that we need to consider and design. So what does it look like when we move to pedagogical response? We found 3 of the same actions that have been seen before in the literature, and this is a scheme of 3 different ways to react to learning analytics that I think is pretty well solidified now. Whole class scaffolding is where you come back and do something for the whole class. I see everybody had trouble with this quiz question. Let's talk about what it was about. Another one is targeted scaffolding, seeing that certain students need help in a certain way and reaching out to them directly. And then finally, this happened more often towards when a semester was wrapping up, but it could be that there's a way to adjust the structure of the course to help with some sort of problem that you're seeing based on the data. Distinguishing which one of these to do is a challenge though, and that's why the most common pattern we found, which had not been reported previously, was to wait and see. This was the situation of saying, I see something, I think I might want to act on it, but I'm not confident yet. I have only been through 1 year of using the analytics. I don't know what it's going to look like. And that was a really interesting thing, and I think it speaks to learning analytics as a curve. We often talk about it as, once people see the data, they will see the light and know exactly how they want to react. But this speaks again to the affective components of feeling confident and wanting to feel it out. And we saw a lot of instructors in this first round say, okay, well, the next time I go through this, I would know what this means because I saw how it played out later in the semester. The final pattern we saw that was very interesting was reflections on pedagogy. And this was an exciting one because it goes beyond analytics as a tool to just tweak little pieces of a course to think much more globally about what we're doing in our teaching. So in this case, the instructor said based on the analytics, they were really going to reconsider exactly what participation means and how they should be assessing it. And so I think that's an important area for thinking about how learning analytics can impact bigger visions of what we're doing in our teaching than just making tiny tweaks. And learning analytics is often talked about as a potentially disruptive technology, but if all we do is tweak the current system, then we're just replicating current practice. And so I think this is the area where learning analytics might provide a window to really change how things are done. Finally, the last piece of the puzzle would be to check impact, but as I mentioned, if you haven't made changes, there wasn't much to check, so there wasn't too much on that front. So we had this model, and again, this was a local model, but I think there certainly are takeaways for other contexts. And the question is, how is this input that we got from instructors going to inform our design? For us, at least, we thought the model offered a really clear starting place to redesign the learning analytics to support instructors' pedagogical decision-making, because now we had a way to guide the designers in thinking about what use would look like early on. So the implications for dashboard redesign, the first one is a whole set of things that you don't usually see talked about in learning analytics, but I think are really important. And these are learning analytic features that are not about the data, but to support processes of use. For example, we saw instructors generating questions they didn't have beforehand. There could be ways to capture these. There could be ways to hold on to these so people can see how answers to them change over time. There's a way to add visual aids as different entry points into the data. We need to think more about incorporating reference points. And finally, since we saw so many people taking a wait and see approach, the idea of being able to flag something to keep an eye on seems really powerful. So these aren't necessarily changes to the data that's presented, but the things that surround them that's going to make that data useful. A second set of things is to make sure that the information is presented in the way that the user, in this case instructors, think about it. So we found in some cases the data would come out of the system in a certain way, but instructors would think about it differently. So they would think about units, or they would think about students in sections in ways the data didn't always represent. There was also a really interesting system of aligning the system timing with teaching practices because the dashboards were accessed almost always late at night when the instructors were home. And so this model that someone's going to check it in their office didn't always work. So the initial system was set up behind a VPN for data security, which doesn't work if it puts a barrier in front of instructors who want to check it the night before they teach. So that's something that's in process in working on how to get around. But I think that it's not something that would have been imagined in the initial prototype. And finally, what we found is these interviews were fascinating sense-making conversations. We learned more about the dashboards, the instructors learned more about the dashboards, and almost all of them, the instructor said something like, we should do more of this. They also talked about the need to share data with a colleague to get information, or perhaps they want to show it to a student. And so if we want to support these kinds of conversations, we needed ways in which the data in the dashboard can be de-identified so that we can share in safe ways that don't violate privacy. So these are the implications that we took away for the design of the dashboard itself. But equally importantly, our partnership led to new models of dashboard redesign and iterative improvement cycles. So coming out of this, there was a move to take one of the dashboards offline, bring in instructors, bring in people from the design team over at Stern, bring in people from library services, and work together to come up with new dashboard designs that met some of the challenges the first round didn't. So here you can see the assessment view of the second dashboard that was set up to meet a particular challenge of instructors wanting to understand if a student's missing assignments, how do I interact with that? And so this brought together information about what assignments they had handed in and how they had done on them. So the student that's been highlighted, who's in the top of the student list, has missed a bunch of assignments, but if you look at the dot highlighted throughout the graphs, on the assignments they've handed in, they've done quite well. And so that would lead an instructor to interact quite differently than if a student who's not handing in assignments and on the ones they're handing in not doing well. So this came out through a redesign process, and now a second dashboard is going to be taken offline to get sort of workshopped. And so that sort of process of working together also came out through a result of these interviews. Finally, one of the big takeaways was it's really important to consider implementation supports to help instructors translate information from a dashboard into actionable insights. So coming out of this, we wanted to find ways to link the pedagogical questions with the answers that the data would hopefully provide, but then how to take action based on it. So a new thing that was built as a result of the study was an interpretive dashboard portal. So the portal is basically when you go to access the dashboards, instead of getting access to dashboards, you actually get access to a series of questions. And so if you see on the left-hand column, you can go through and pick. In this case, I've picked the question, how can I identify struggling students? And so then there's a little conceptual piece about how one does this in general, and then you move into how the dashboard can help you in this process. So again, this is forwarding the instructor questions and bringing the dashboard in as a piece of a process that hopefully is already being engaged in, as opposed to saying, here's a dashboard, what are you going to do with it? Importantly, at the end of each of these articles is a what next button that says, okay, if students are struggling, what are the things that you might do? And again, there's an explanatory video. So this same information is also pushed out in weekly emails. There's workshops and coaching sessions that are conducted, and this is really supporting the process of collaborative interpretation. And finally, through all this, we're trying to build up contextualized networks of people who can make sense of these with each other. So what I've just gone through, hopefully not too quickly, is the middle portion of this graph, how we gathered information from instructors to go about redesigning a dashboard, but also really thinking more about what was needed besides just the dashboard to make learning analytics useful in instructional practice. What I'm going to switch to for the second portion of the talk is the thing on the right-hand side, which is going even further than gathering input from, but involving humans, designing learning analytics for humans, really with humans, because you're going to generate the ideas with them. And so what I'm going to talk about is a student-facing learning analytics project, which was done in a co-design and participatory model. So this is a project that NYU-LEARN partnered with NYU-IT, the educational technologists in the different schools, student advisors, and students themselves, in order to come up with a design for a student-facing learning analytics tool that would, hopefully, be really useful and meet students' needs. So some key questions to think about in moving beyond just getting input from your users and really working with them is, who are you inviting into the room? Certainly for the student tool, we want to bring in students, but which students are we bringing in? Picking the easiest, most willing volunteers isn't necessarily going to get you where you need to be. What do you tell them about the project? What do you show them about the project? How much is revealed to them? how are they invited to take part, and when are they invited to take part? Do they just share some ideas and then you take it from there, or are you bringing them back again and again? So we tried our best to target students who were extreme users. I'll talk about this more, but first generation college students who really were going to have extreme cases of needs for support, and to invite them in really openly and invite them in multiple times. Students have often been excluded from these processes, so we think this is a very important step in really thinking about the less developed area of student-facing learning analytics. So the project started with a needs analysis, which is still the getting information from. There was a steering committee which brought together not students yet, but faculty, staff, advisors, and really framed the project as targeting first generation undergrads, primarily in Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and thinking about a focus on students who were first generation. This led to a series of interviews with advisors who pointed the interviewers to faculty, who pointed them to students. And this led to the creation of a set of personas of students with different salient challenges. And importantly, and I'll mention this a little bit more later, quotes were used to represent personas, and these were quotes directly from the students. So the student personas that were used for design actually had real student words behind them. So with this needs analysis in hand, we went into the co-design process. We advertised all the way across the campus, which I'm not sure produced too much on its own, but using our advisor network, we were able to reach out and get a total of 10 students in, most of whom were actually first generation college students. So that again is talking about the sort of existing networks we built on to make this work possible. So the 10 students came in for 3 5-hour design sessions, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the human-centered design methodology that we used to co-design the analytics with them. A couple of key design ingredients to shape the overall experience. Some of these are going to sound very obvious, but they're not commonly how design is done. So the first thing was to set the scope of the problem really wide. It wasn't just about dashboards, it wasn't just about data, it wasn't just about academics. There was no limit. The objectives were flexible. The idea was to think about what do you need to support you as a student, and how could the configuration of things plus maybe other things really come into play to help. The second one was to create a safe design space. The workshops were led by our doctoral students, and they were done with undergrads. There was no faculty and no staff, no those people in the room, and that was really done intentionally to reduce the power dynamics and make it a safe space. And from the kinds of comments that occurred, I think that worked quite well. And finally, the process of design isn't easy, pat, or straightforward, and so there was a lot of work with generative tensions and leveraging these tensions as fuel for design. So it wasn't simply, what would you like? Okay, here it is. But it was really, with the wide problem scope and safe design space, allowing people to wrestle with what this was all about. So a great example is at the very start, a student stood up and said, is this just about my academic success? Because my real problems have to do with being happy and fulfilled while I'm being successful. So they almost immediately expanded the scope beyond just do well in classes, which frankly was somewhat of the framing we'd gone in with. But as opposed to saying, no, we're just doing this small scope of thing, let's think about how the data can help you succeed. That was really important to engage with, because it led to a question of, well, what are the challenges? And it turns out that a lot of the challenges that are academic are also tied to non-academic challenges for students. And so that really expanded the scope, and you'll see led to some things that were in the final design. So the workshop process had several parts. I'm going to focus on the sort of the key ideation sections over here, but I will just mention at the start that the icebreaker is on the graph, not as a throwaway, but that was really important to create the safe space. This was only 3 workshops of 5 hours each, which is actually relatively limited engagement, but given the time of year and the time frames we were working on, that was what was possible. So actually spending a really well thought out portion of time getting the students comfortable with each other and with the facilitators was really important. So there was acting, there was improv, there was a lot of fun things that I think really set the stage for what came later. That was followed by a mini lecture on design thinking, so getting students familiar with the process of design. I think it's important to mention that one reason people don't always engage in co-design is they talk about how the users don't know enough about design, or they don't know enough about data, and with support, people can do just fine. So what I'm going to focus on, though, is the three key sections of the empathy mapping, the data mapping, and then the ideation to prototypes. So the first set of this is the empathy mapping. So the entire design process was centered on what the personas I mentioned earlier would feel or think about ideas. So it wasn't just about what would this data look like, it was about what will this student think about this. So this is an example of two of the student persona descriptions. The first one is a sort of, and this came out of the interviews, is your typical overwhelmed student. College is more challenging than high school. They're not the best in the class anymore. They probably could use some help with time management, writing, advocating for themselves. You have a first generation transitioner. This is the extreme user who, by virtue of their very particular needs, if we can meet those, we're probably going to also meet the needs of the average user. And for the first generation students, everything was weightier because NYU is a great opportunity and the stakes of doing well are high. Similar things of not necessarily being a standout anymore, but also feeling a bit different from their classmates and feeling pressure and not knowing how to navigate opportunities because they may not get some of the support that students with parents who went to college can provide. This is shown so you can see what the personas are about, but that's not how they were shared with students. The way they were shared with students was in the form of quotes from the students from which they were generated. So, you know, Olivia says, I used to do well in school, really well. I was the valedictorian. I always knew I wanted to come to New York City. Now I'm not so sure. And Frank, the first generation transitioner, he studies a bit every day, but without a lot of structure. So he's trying very hard, but he doesn't actually really know how to prioritize. And he talks about how he had a friend, one of the mentors, who told him how to navigate. There was stuff out there. I wish he would have told me earlier. So, you know, these were much more extensive when provided to the students, but they were a starting point that felt very real. And then the students were asked to engage with them and validate them and update them and change them. So here you see some students from the workshop working with the Olivia and Frank personas and really trying to figure out where they're about. And with the empathy mapping, it connected not just into what did they need to do, but how they were feeling about things. The second technique that was used that was very important here was design cards. So this was a deck of cards that tried to scaffold students in thinking about data and asking questions and seeing possibilities, even though they might not be and probably were not experts in LMS data. So this was a series of cards, and the green cards would be different pieces of information that could come out of the system. The blue cards would be verbs, and the oranges might be what you would do about it. So they were asked to sort of make mixes and matches of cards as an inspiration, and then when ones made sense, they would use those to take the ideas further, saying, well, how much I was interacting and how much others did, could that connect me to anything? Maybe, maybe not. And so they would mix and match, and this was really a way to get them thinking about the data in ways they might not have on their own. And finally, as they started to generate ideas for things that would be useful, we engaged in live prototyping. So the students would come up with ideas and they would draw things, but then we actually had a UX designer in the room, I think this was in the second session, materializing the ideas into sketches, reflecting them back to students in a more formalized, developed form that the students could then give input into. Just to show you what this looked like, one of the tools that is still in development now, first was the Hive, and this was the notion of the students feeling like there was 1,000 things they needed to keep track of, and they needed ways to keep track of them together. So the Hive design was first drawn by the students, kind of looking like this, and it had to do with all the different classes they were managing, all the different resources, but also things they were managing that weren't necessarily connected to a class. So then the design was expanded and reflected back by the facilitators and the live designer, and they added other pieces to the puzzle. So there's a timeline here you didn't see previously and they said, would this be useful? How would we work with this? So this was a multiple iteration cycle that eventually was turned into a digital prototype that could be brought back to the students for feedback. And you'll notice here that there's things that are classes, and there's things like wellness that are not classes. There's things like the Career Center, and the students really felt like it was important that they could put everything together, not just these are the classes I'm in right now. And finally, that takes us to the current version of the prototype, which is actually in usability testing. Once that next round of iterations happens, again, the goal is, I think, to put it back in the hands of a small number of students so we can have rapid iteration and slow scaling and see what this really looks like when it's out there in practice. A couple of important emergent themes we found from working with students. We think of dashboards as being about data, but for students, data was really only part of the story. They came up with tools that involved a lot more than dashboards, And part of that was because they were thinking more holistically. They felt that academic help was part of it, but that for the academic help to succeed, there was a bigger piece of the puzzle. And a lot of that really connected to the final point, which was social. Most of the students felt that the ways they got unstuck or the ways they'd found strategies for success wasn't from information on a table or in a computer, but was from talking with people and getting advice. So the sharing of information with people, finding who to connect to about what, was seen as probably the most powerful possibility of data. And that's really a very different direction than we had thought of when we originally imagined a student interacting with their own data. So they really saw data as a window to finding help from other people, often other students. So that's where we are in this project. It is, I think, so important to think about the ways in which all the pieces were intertwined, and that having the students there really helped reframe the challenge we were trying to meet as one of just information to an individual as to part of the bigger structure they're operating in. So I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions, so I'm not going to, we had a couple other projects, but we're going to leave them on the side for now. And I think I'm just going to mention a couple of takeaways that we have for designing learning analytics for humans with humans. The first one is that gathering input, at least input that's useful from humans to inform analytics, is about so much more than just asking people what they would like. I think there's a huge amount that we can learn from the HCI community, from work that's been done in participatory design, user-centered design, lots more techniques than I've talked about here today about ways to really create spaces in which users contribute to design meaningfully, and that creates opportunities and gives them the tools to be able to do so well. I think a second thing that's really important, and maybe an argument for why it's so important to do this, is that both efforts described here led to a variety of things we never would have imagined. Our focus was on providing LMS data to students, and now the tool is also about ways to bring in non-academic components and to connect with other students to get the kind of support that they need for the larger picture. For the instructional dashboard, there's an entire portal devoted to supporting faculty in using the tool rather than just a tool. And I think I wanted to share that there was a real concern going into this that we were burdening people who are already overstretched. Students don't have time, faculty don't have time, but we've had really positive responses to everyone who's been involved. Students came back after a 5-hour session for another one, which was optional. Instructors seem to really engage and enjoy these conversations because it was helping them work through something that was important to them. And in the end, it didn't seem like a burden at all. So I think, before I go to that last slide, I just want to say that I think it's so important to engage in these processes, which are maybe different than the common skill set we come to. So in learning analytics, a lot of our training has been about how do we get the data, how do we work with the data, how do we do something interesting analytically with the data, but all of these processes of human-centered design are going to help us do that better. And so are these things that we can engage in as learning analytics designers? In some case, yes. In some case, we need partners. I think that's another big takeaway, is that all of this work involved a team with a lot of different skills and a lot of different skill sets. So we certainly, and I didn't focus on it today, we certainly have the technical people who were able to wrangle 28 different data streams into a clear flow and to be producing these dashboards that work reliably. But that work has to be in service to the larger picture I'm trying to present today in order to be useful. So I guess what I hope people take away from this is both, it's so important to bring humans in early on and often to generate something that's useful and going to be used in the world, rather than something that just looks really pretty on a shelf. And some ideas about how to do so through partnerships, through getting input from people, through co-designing with them. And I think maybe one final thought is that obviously this takes time and effort. I think we are very lucky to have an IT team that gets it and is willing to say, we'll take the time to do these processes so the thing that we build later is good, rather than we have to build now. And so, within an institution that often wants to get things out there quickly, being able to explain why this is going to produce a different product, a better product, something that wouldn't happen otherwise, is an argument that we've been able to make successfully, but does need to be made. So I did want to give a shout out to Yonji, JP, and Fabio, who are 3 PhD students here with NYU-LEARN, who have done a lot of work spearheading the projects that I described today. And I think with that, I will say thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Alyssa, for presentation. So we now have already a couple of questions, well, more than a couple, in our chat box. And so let me start by asking a couple of those that have been asked, and then everybody who wants to ask a question, just press the raise hand button. You first need to click on the chat button, and then I'll unmute you. So because there's a lot of people, so it'll be easier to go that way. So one of the first question was how the instructors for the initial case studies were selected, asked by Rob.
So the instructors for the initial case studies were, you say selected, I would say more like solicited. It wasn't that there was 1,000 people applying for the 5 spots. The goal was to find people who fit the case studies and could help adjust the case studies. So as I mentioned, we purposely designed the case studies to represent some of the different situations. So one was a large undergraduate STEM class, one was a small online graduate seminar, one was, I think, a course in the engineering school. So, no, not engineering school, what was it? But so the point was the case studies were designed to be different and unique to represent the different situations. And so the idea was to get a diverse spectrum of instructors who taught large classes, who taught small classes, who taught here in New York, who taught on our global campuses around the world. And so that went out through, certainly general calls went out, but it's always through networks. And so I think maybe it's important to mention at NYU, we have a central IT group, and then we have teaching and learning groups or educational technology groups in most of the different schools. And there's, I think, 13, 15 different schools. And so that was a network of NYU staff who were already working with instructors who were interested in teaching, interested in innovating. And so reaching out through that network and finding people who could match the different cases was how we went about it. I should mention, while it started with 5, it's much bigger now. There's, I think, somewhere between 100 and 200 instructors involved in the current pilot, and it's growing each semester. But again, that's, I think, 2 years later, so it's bigger, but it's not, we're not trying to grow too fast. So, you know, it went from 5 to 30 to 60 to 100 or so, not from 5 to 5,000.
Okay, just before we go with questions, I have a couple of announcements. So first of all, if you can, I put in the chat a link to a survey to complete. We will really appreciate your feedback and some ideas how to improve and who can be the next in this webinar. Also, you have a couple of links for the next talk. Will be Professor Laura Allen from University of New Hampshire on December 11. Okay, now anybody have a question? Raise hand and I will mute you. I have a couple of questions in the chat as well. So another question that was asked was, how can be a way of taking actions to revise the course before it ends? So is there a way of improving the course through these analytics before it ends?
I mean, that depends a lot on your course context, but and I think the smaller the course, the easier it is to do it. But in courses that I've taught, sometimes I can see early on that, there's, I mean, these are basic things, but there's too many readings each week. I need to think about eliminating some of them. Or I can see that there's too much material before the first quiz, so I need to split a quiz in half. You're not going to do generally radical changes to your course design while it's in process, but you can do small tweaks. I think in one case, they found that quizzes and videos were not getting, students were missing them, and so they were able to extract them out. But most course redesign efforts are going to happen at the end of the semester. That's actually something we've thought about quite a bit, which is, this is an extreme version of it, but we might want different kinds of dashboards to look at while a course is in progress than we do at the end of the term. Because while a course is in progress, we have certain sets of questions. For example, which students need my help? what topics are students really struggling with. Whereas at the end of the semester, you have sort of a slower, longer view and a chance to think about, okay, how can I rearrange the pieces? So one thing we've considered, though I don't know we want to start doubling down on designing double the dashboards, is are the questions during the semester when things are fast and furious, and at the end when they're more reflective, requiring of different kinds of information presentations and different kinds of supports for that kind of decision making.
Lillian, soon, can you, is the mic working?
Hi.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Alyssa. It's lovely to see your research here. I'm involved with another lecturer who's doing, who's using the learning analytics, but she's quite skilled in statistics. So it's lovely to see your dashboard created in a human-centered way and how the lecturers are trying to interpret that. And what she's gone away and done, because she's highly skilled in stats, is she's tried to do correlations between lecture attendance, seminar attendance, the number of times they do the quizzes and how well they score on quizzes. So she's done this complex analysis to really get at the learning analytics, and she's found correlations between certain things and not other things. And I'm just wondering, in your dashboard design, is there a, how complex is it? How does it draw together that kind of correlation, or is it literally the way students are succeeding or not succeeding on quizzes and downloading materials off a learning management system?
So the first versions were sort of, here's what students are doing, but the revised versions are getting towards some of those questions. In fact, some of them have it in it already. I wouldn't say that they are doing a correlation in that they are actually calculating the correlation statistic, but they're helping people look for relationships between things like attendance and number of quizzes taken and scores. And the reason I say it's not necessarily just a correlation is that a correlation will only reveal if you have a linear relationship. And a lot of times these relationships aren't linear. So you have people who are, below a certain, you miss a certain number of courses and suddenly there's a drop. So we have been working on ways to look at those relationships, but not just from a correlation linear perspective, but also looking for, where are there cutoff points where you can miss 1 or 2 classes and be okay, but after you miss 3, things get really dire.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
Asil, just a second. Asil, yes.
Hi there. I'm just wondering if you got a sense of the percentage of faculty and instructors that would be on board with taking on a learning analytics approach and integrating that into their instruction.
You mean sort of a survey across all instructors, how many would be interested? No, I don't have a number for that. And I think it's tricky because being on board with learning analytics in general, I'm not sure that that's a thing. I think it has a lot to do with what's the specific kinds of informations and tools being offered, and are they going to fit into what I'm doing right now? So, throwing it out there, sort of, would you be interested in the general? I don't think we'd get a good answer. We found really the way that this works best is through word of mouth and through spreading of networks. So, we're starting to have people in most of the schools who are using the tool and excited about it. And then someone else says, oh, what are you doing? And then they weren't interested. Their answer would have been no, but it becomes yes. So I don't think it's about setting a straight survey. I think it's about all the things we know about technology adoption and raising awareness, raising interest, giving people a chance to trial the tools in a low stakes kind of way, leading towards, at least for some people, adoption. I think everybody, we're hearing in the news outside of our work lives, everything about, data informed this and that. So I think that there's generally people are very interested in it. It's not, that's the problem. It's oh, now I have to spend the time to make sense of this and actually do something with it, where the challenges lie. So it's not about interest. It's about when do we try to capitalize on that interest and bring people into using a tool when we think that we can support them in doing it so that they stay around, versus having sort of the problem of the technology hype cycle where they thought it was going to be amazing and it's too hard and then they walk away from it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Anushka, do you want to?
Yeah. I think, judging by the time, that it's time to round up the webinar for today. Do you agree, Peter?
Yes.
Okay.
So one thing, we're going to make it recording available, send everybody, and also to invite you to join the discussion in Google Groups, where we're going to, you know, continue discussion. So, I mean, there are many questions that they haven't been answered, but, you know, feel free to continue discussing there. And also, if you want to join our newsletter, so to, you know, be updated all the things we do and all the future webinars as well. So we're going to have one webinar every 2 months. The next one will be in December, on December 11th, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Professor Laura Allen from University of New Hampshire will be talking about writing analytics, and you'll see that announced as well. Okay, so thank you everyone for coming, and thanks Alyssa for a great presentation, and yeah, hope everybody had a good time.
Thanks so much, Vitanushka.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.